You open your eyes not to sunlight or an alarm clock, but to the stale smell of salty air and rotting food. As the ship's surgeon, you don't start the day with coffee. You start with a crowd of miserable seamen. Your morning duty is the sick call at the mainmast, where every scratch, stomach cramp, and murmur is your problem. Outside, buckets of seawater serve as drinking water, and one surgeon recalled a deck tub that was often stinking and full of little worms. In other words, the water might as well be soup stock. A healthy breakfast? Forget it. Your sailors chew on salt beef, rancid pork, and ship's biscuits, baked so hard they can break a tooth, for most of the week. An early surgeon blamed the entire salt diet of cured meat for scurvy outbreaks. Between bites of bland pea porridge, men pick lice out of their shirts. Fleas and scabies are everywhere on a crowded ship. In fact, one period writer notes that sailors simply accepted lice and fleas as just one of those things. You spend your days rubbing vinegar into decks and blankets, an early antiseptic, and fumigating the sick bay with burning brimstone sulfur, just to keep the air from stinking. Even so, diseases run rampant. Measles or flu on board rapidly morph into ship-wide epidemics, and dysentery, typhus, and malaria prowl unchecked. When a sailor gets diarrhea, they called it the flux. Meanwhile, watching a man gulp down sour water, mixed with a spoonful of copper to kill bacteria, is just part of the daily grind. Cockpit of carnage. When battle erupts, the ship transforms into your worst nightmare. Wounded men are carried below decks to the surgeon's quarters, called the cockpit, a tiny, low-ceilinged space just above the lowest deck. By lantern light or candle, you find sailors stacked on makeshift tables, usually wooden chests, groaning in agony. The cockpit was cramped and dark. One surgeon recalled how their table had to be sanded before battle so doctors wouldn't slip in the blood. By the end of combat, you and your mates are literally smeared with blood. We looked more like butchers than doctors, one account admits. In the chaos, you shout orders while shoving bandages on chest wounds, or work the limb saw as a man screams into a wooden block. Pain relief. Forget anesthetic, it didn't exist yet. Ether and chloroform were still decades away, after the age of sail. The only medicine for agony was a stiff drink or two, but even that was skimpy. Contrary to myth, patients didn't get drunked up on grog. At best, they were given a dram, a tiny sip, of rum and a leather strap to bite. One memoirist dryly notes that a surgeon's job was to encourage the patient, having given him half a glass of wine, to endure his pain, but in practice it was usually a single shot and a pray-it-works speech. In fact, loblolly boys, medical assistants often as young as teens, would shuffle about, pouring sand on blood-slick floors and filling buckets with boiling tar for cauterizing wounds. They even cleaned up severed limbs like grisly chores. You, the surgeon, do the worst work, amputations and chest wounds. Amputation was shockingly common, and had to be fast. A good surgeon aimed to saw a limb off in under 2 minutes. Surgeons wrote that speed was crucial. The longer you take, the more blood loss and infection. One guide exclaims, "A saw be always in readiness, well filed, for that one tooth in a saw may break." Imagine dragging a serrated knife and bone saw through muscle, yelling at the patient to be brave, all while he bites down on a block of wood you're holding in his mouth. And this all happens beneath gunfire. Stray splinters and cannonballs regularly rattle through the cockpit. One surgeon described holding a man's wound when suddenly a cannonball struck a young gentleman on the head, dashing his brains. And a splinter struck my head and rendered me insensible. In other words, even the most protected place on board wasn't exactly safe. Rations, scurvy, and sickness. Between battles, you still have all the everyday maladies, scurvy chief among them. Scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency, but 17th to 18th century doctors didn't know that. They just watched sailors' gums bleed and legs swell after months at sea. Early manuals blamed it on salt diet, essentially living on salted pork and ship's biscuit. One 1600 surgeon lamented that scurvy hath so long and so fiercely assailed sailors. There are few diseases at sea happeneth to seamen, but the scurvy hath a part in them. In plain terms, every disease seemed tied to scurvy. Symptoms of scurvy are nasty, weakness, joint pain, bleeding. By the time it got bad, half the crew might be bedridden, and the nurse, sees dark bruises and receding gums everywhere. You do what you can. In the 1700s, that might be bleeding the man or giving him vinegar, both useless. Or if you were clever, you'd force-feed citrus when you hit land. In fact, James Linn's famous 1747 trial gave 2 sailors oranges and lemons every day, and they made a rapid, immediate recovery, whereas others did not. But for decades, Admiralty thought briny grog and porter would suffice. On long voyages, scurvy kept killing men. 2 million sailors died from scurvy from the 1500s to 1700s. It wasn't until the 1790s that reformers finally forced lemon juice into the daily grog ration, nearly eliminating scurvy. In the meantime, every port stop was a health risk. Men would bring back fevers and fevers of unfamiliar diseases. A surgeon could see dysentery, typhus, syphilis, and even malaria or yellow fever. If you were in the tropics, spread like wildfire through the crowded bunks. Water still wasn't reliably clean, so the flux, diarrhea plus vomiting, was a constant killer. Rats ran freely in the hold, feasting on stores and spreading plague-bearing fleas, though they didn't know about fleas causing disease yet. Add zero sanitation. Bathtubs didn't exist, underwear was worn for months, and it feels like a floating plague pit. Captains knew their crew would get sick. Even Captain Cook fought battles with dirt, scrubbing decks with lime juice or vinegar, and insisting on fresh food when possible. But your ship often doesn't run like the Endeavour. By late 18th century naval manuals even advise, give everyone a bit of port or wine, not to intoxicate, but to keep bladders working and give vitamin antioxidants. But mostly you treat symptoms. When someone vomits with fever, you purge them, force vomiting or diarrhea. When someone gets a fever, you bleed them, literally opening veins to let out bad blood. Not only is it brutal, it often killed the patient outright. As one historian grimly notes, those remedies probably harmed more than they helped. You might end up nursing your own ashes like an alchemist, burning brimstone to kill miasma, marinating sickbay linens in vinegar, and monitoring that every hammock is aired out. Meanwhile, weevils scurry through the biscuit barrel, and cockroaches lurk in the lantern light. Tools and torture. A ship surgeon's kit was primitive. Imagine a wooden box full of blades, not as precision scalpels but as brute instruments. Amputation saws, pruning shears, crooked bone knives, tourniquets, and stout needles. For example, in 1812 surgeon Alexander Jack's kit, HMS Shannon, included an amputating saw, several specialized knives, metal forceps, thread needles, and even screw-type tourniquets. If you had a stable patient, rare, you'd sew up wounds with curved needles and linen thread. Otherwise, your standard practice was quick slash-and saw. One instruction manual even advises, let the dismembering saw be always in readiness, well filed and clean. In plain speak, keep your saw sharp, because one dull tooth could break off in a bone mid-cut. There were no scalpels like we know today. Surgeons often likened themselves to butchers. In fact, one memoir said bluntly that under fire he worked with knife and saw on human flesh and bones as freely as the butcher at the shambles. To stop fatal bleeding, early surgeons used hot tar or a red-hot knife pressed to stumps, gruesome cautery that often killed people outright. By mid-1700s they learned to tie off arteries with linen tape instead, which helped a lot. Tourniquets were lifesavers. Remember Nelson again, who lost his arm at Tenerife in 1797. He lived because his nephew quickly applied a cloth and screw tourniquet and stopped the bleeding. Bandages were soaked in vinegar. Science was slow, but they noticed it cleaned wounds. After any operation, you'd have to bandage the stump tight, slap on an egg white poultice or vinegar compress, and hope the patient's immune system fought off gangrene. Survival after injury was grim. Even though only about 5% died during battle, once infection set in, only 10 to 50% of the wounded lived. In short, an amputation was truly the last resort, because it often meant shutting off life. And you did all this in those tiny, dark quarters, by lantern or lamplight, while the ship pitched under your feet. No imaging, no anesthetic, just you, your tools, and a rowdy cabin full of bleeding men. Many surgeons admitted they weren't doctors by today's standards, more like field butchers trained for the job. In fact, if there was absolutely no surgeon aboard, the duty would fall to the ship's carpenter or even the cook. Just picture the cook fumbling with a saw on your leg. The toll. By the numbers, it was bad. In Britain's Napoleonic-era navy, about half of all casualties came from sickness and accidents, only around 8% from enemy guns. That tells you something. A ship's surgeon usually spent more time on fevers and dysentery than on bullet wounds. On average, each ill sailor added to your ledger with daily notes in the sick book, a regulation practice. You literally kept two journals, one for diseases and one for operations. You might complain about overtime. Surgeons often worked around the clock during action, with only mates and cabin boys assisting. One 1676 surgeon, Richard Wiseman, casually wrote that he never even noticed if a patient was sitting or lying. He just cut along with his mates holding the men tight. No one's complaining to corporate HR here. And after all the horrors, there were no medals for it. Most wartime surgeons died young of chest infections or drank themselves to death. They did get paid better than common sailors. In the late 1700s, a young surgeon earned around £14 per month, about double a seaman, plus a reward for treating maladies like venereal disease. With prize money, a lucky surgeon could make over £200 a year, but only if he lived to see it. We should mention one silver lining. At least surgeons were ranked as officers by the early 1800s, meaning better quarters and respect than a random able seaman. But in daily life, that rank didn't mask the stink of blood, puke, and seasickness. You might think you'd outrank the rats and the disease, but on the Orca or Victory, you ranked right next to them. By day's end, you smell of sweat, blood, tar, and brimstone. Your best friend might be rum, to calm your own nerves, but it's not keeping your stomach down. Every meal is a gamble with botulism or spoiled meat. Many a ship surgeon ended up as a half-mad drunk telling tall tales about how he saw 19 of a 20-man surgery die on the table. So next time you gripe about desk job doldrums, spare a thought for your great-great-grandfather. He probably wasn't sawing off a limb or digging bullets out of a comrade's skull at 3 a.m., thanks to modern medicine. You have anesthesia, sanitation, x-rays. He had a flickering lantern, a handful of rust, and a lot of luck. That's why being a ship surgeon in the age of sail truly sucked, in every possible way.